And the purpose of that recording is so that obviously people can view this afterwards if they aren't able to join us today. But we have 72 people on the call, which is great. Before I go on, can everybody see the presentation slide deck?
Yes. Yeah, we can
Great.
see it.
Great,
Yes.
thank you. So with this number of people on the call, I don't think we're going to do a, can I blow it up? Can I make it bigger? It's actually full screen for me, so I don't think I can make it any bigger.
Daryl, if they go into Spotlight for layout, it'll look bigger.
Right, so go down to the very bottom right of the Meet screen, click the three dots, click Change Layout, and one of the options is Spotlight, and that'll highlight and make bigger the main focus of the screen, which should be the presentation. So I think most of you know who I am, but for those of you who don't, my name is Daryl Branson. I'm the State 911 Program Manager for the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. And what I'm going to be talking about today is House Bill 1293, which passed this year. It was signed by the governor on July 10th, so it is now law. And it goes into effect pretty much immediately. It does a number of things that have already made changes, and there are other changes that will be going into effect as certain benchmark dates are reached. So I'm going to be going over a very high-level overview of what House Bill 1293 does for 911 in Colorado and what it means to you at the local 911 authorities or public safety answering points. Before I go on from there, I do also need to mention that there is going to be a proceeding that's opening tomorrow, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. We weren't really sure if I was going to be acting as trial staff or advisory staff. I am going to be acting as advisory staff, and what that means is that there are certain things about the proceeding that I won't be able to talk about today, and that I will ask you not to talk to me about regarding your opinions as to what level the surcharges should be set, those sorts of things. And the reason for that is because the commission operates in sort of a semi-judiciary manner. And if you're in a court case, one side can't talk to the judge without the other side being present. It's the same kind of concept where I'm acting as an advisor to the judge, who in this case is the commission. So I can't be getting information from you as to what you think the outcome of the proceeding should be. But I can talk to you generally about the process of the proceeding and the timeline of the dates, and that's what I'm going to be covering today, as well as a lot of other things that are outside of that proceeding. So first of all, here's a list of what I'm going to be talking about today, and there's quite a bit, so we're going to try to get this in under an hour to respect your time, but we're going to be talking about the definition changes, not all of them, because almost every definition was touched at least at some point. We're going to be talking about changes to the local emergency telephone charges, statewide 911 surcharge, prepaid 911 surcharge, audits of carriers, surcharge remittance practices, changes to the eligible 911 expenses list, expanded liability immunity, changes to the multi-line telephone system section of the statute, and then talk about the procedure going forward and what the next steps are going to be. Whoops. Yeah. So first, a little background. This is legislation that was originally drafted through a series of workshops held by the Colorado 911 Advisory Task Force's Legislative Committee. And it took about 18 months. I didn't get the exact dates of when we started and when we were finished, but it was about a year and a half, and it was a lot of work with a lot of people involved. And then once it got into the legislative process, as frequently happens, it was changed pretty significantly during the legislative process through amendments. So if there's something you don't like in the bill, I wouldn't blame the 911 Advisory Task Force or anybody on the Legislative Committee, because what the bill ended up being was significantly different than what was originally proposed. But it does do a number of things that were hoped for by the original drafters in that Legislative Committee. And this is the first major overhaul of 911 funding legislation in Colorado in 30 years. There have been small bills here and there. There was a bill to add voice over internet protocol. There was a bill to add wireless before that. There was a bill to add prepaid 911 surcharge. This is the first bill, however, that has touched every part of the state's 911 legislation in Title 29. So it was a very big deal, and it is a very lengthy bill with a lot of pieces and moving parts to it. So I'm going to try to break it down for you today. Some terminology. A couple of things become more important in our new environment with 911 than were before. So first of all, 911 governing body. When I use that term today, know that I'm talking about a 911 authority. Most of the 911 authorities in the state use that term authority. They might call it an emergency telephone service authority or a 911 authority board. Those are all synonymous with 911 governing body. I'm going to be using that term because that's what's in the actual legislation and has been in the statute all this time is 911 governing body, but it's the same thing as a local 911 authority. And that's just the board or governing entity, whatever it may be, that is authorized at the local level to set the local emergency telephone charge and to pay eligible 911 expenses with revenues from those charges. Another term that becomes important that we make sure we get right is emergency telephone charge. We've always kind of informally referred to this as local 911 surcharges or just 911 surcharges. But now that we also have a state 911 surcharge, it's important to make sure we're using the right terms so that we know which one we're talking about. When we talk about the emergency telephone charge, that's the local charge set by the 911 governing body or the 911 authority that applies only to billing addresses in that 911 authority's service area. So if I say emergency telephone charge, I'm talking about the local charge. If I say 911 surcharge, I'm talking about the state one. I'll also try to say statewide 911 surcharge just to help differentiate it. But that's the difference between those two terms. So speaking of the statewide 911 surcharge, the bill actually just refers to it as the 911 surcharge. But to help differentiate today, I'm going to try to use the term statewide 911 surcharge. This is a newly created surcharge that will be set by the commission annually. It's going to be listed separately on every phone bill, at least the phone bills that list fees separately. And the funds from this surcharge will be remitted to the commission or its agent, unlike the emergency telephone charge, which is remitted directly by carriers to the local 911 governing bodies. There's also a prepaid 911 surcharge. I have a typo there, should be surcharged, not surcharged. That already existed, but that is a 911 surcharge that is applied at point of sale for prepaid telecommunication services. That is now going to be a per transaction, not pre-transaction. I guess I should have had somebody proofread this for me. A per transaction surcharge. It always was per transaction and applied at point of sale. The difference now is that it's going to be a flat fee rather than a percentage. But we'll talk more about that later. And kind of going from some initial terminology will take us right into the definitions section. That's section 101 of the statute. Most of the definitions in the statute were updated and there were some new definitions added. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would take the whole hour, but I'll give you some highlights. There was a definition added for 911 access connection, which is defined as any communications service capable of making a 911 call. And the reason why that was added is because in the definitions in the past applied the local emergency telephone charge to landline and to wireless and to voice over internet protocol specifically, but we don't know what new types of technology may come down the line in the future. So the idea of defining this 911 access connection to mean anything that is capable of making a 911 call, the purpose of that was to future-proof the surcharge so that it can be applied to any other type of communication technology that may be invented in the future that can access 911. So it broadens that definition, and this is something very similar is being done in other states that have been updating their definitions to help future-proof their legislation so that they don't have to come back to it every couple of years and add a new type of technology that can access 911. A definition was added for basic emergency service. Basic emergency service is the part of the 911 call flow that is regulated by the commission. The fact that we did not have a definition for basic emergency service in the statute has been a point of contention in the past because it left it open for interpretation. But now we have a definition. The definition is identical to the one that is currently in the Commission's rules. So that definition from the rules was added to the statute to provide more definition as to what basic emergency service is, rather than having to infer what that is. So now we're on to talking about changes to emergency telephone charges. This is section 102 of the statute. This is 29.11.102. The most important point that I want to drive home: local emergency telephone charges are still local. Nothing has changed there. The carriers will collect the local emergency telephone charge, whatever your 911 governing body has set that charge to be, from the customers that have service addresses or billing addresses in your service area, and they will remit them directly to the through that 911 governing body. Whoops, didn't go forward yet. What's different is that the threshold at which emergency telephone charges require permission from the PUC used to be 70 cents, and it has been 70 cents since 1990. It never changed. And it no longer has any meaning because every 911 governing body in the state has an emergency telephone charge that's already at 70 cents or higher. So what this bill does is it makes it so that every October 1st, starting this year, the Commission will set a threshold at which the PUC approval will be required for an emergency telephone charge. So the Commission can set this rate wherever it wants. It can set it at 70 cents if it didn't want to change anything. It can set it at $5 if it wanted to just come up with something so that nobody would ever have to ask for approval. Or it can set it anywhere in between. This is one of the things that we will be opening the proceeding for tomorrow, so that the Commission can set this rate by October 1st. And it will be adjusted annually. Now, what the only thing the statute says is that the Commission should take into effect inflation, as well as the needs of the 911 governing bodies. So those are the guidelines that the statute gives the Commission to consider when it is setting this threshold. And again, it will be adjusted annually. Governing bodies must publish their surcharge rates annually. That was actually already in the statute, even though I don't think most of the 911 governing bodies in the state were doing it. But it is still in the statute with this revision. So it's something that I'm hoping that we start seeing annual publications from the 911 governing bodies, letting their citizens as well as the carriers know that what their surcharge is. And then another thing that's changed, and this was part of the amendment process, and I don't know the full reasoning behind it, but new emergency telephone charge rates at the local level can only go into effect February 1st or June 1st. Previously, 911 new emergency telephone charges could go into effect whenever the local governing body determined that it was necessary, or 60 days after approval from the Commission if it was over 70 cents. Now, even if the Commission approves it, it can't go into effect until the following February 1st or June 1st. There's also the requirement that the 911 governing body also gives 60 days notice to the carriers, is also still in the legislation or in the statute, which means that essentially you can only change your surcharge rates in December to go into effect on February 1st, or in March to go into effect on June 1st, because you do still have to give 60 days notice. So those are important points to know if you're a 911 governing body that is considering raising your 911 surcharge. You have to know what those timelines are so that you can engage with that and make sure that you're meeting those deadlines in time for the following date that it can go into effect on. More about emergency telephone charges. If you do need to raise your emergency telephone charge above the threshold, you can still do that. The new thresholds don't change that fact. Just like now, you will have to file an application with the Commission. So I'm not making any recommendation as to what the surcharge should be, but let's say just for the sake of illustration that the threshold is set at $1.50 by the commission by October 1st. If you need to go above $1.50, you can still do that, but you will have to file an application with the commission, just like you would have to do now. The difference is that if you need to raise your surcharge, but it's below that threshold, let's say the commission sets it at $1.50, and you are currently at $1.20, and let's say you want to raise yours to $1.50, you can do that without actually applying for permission from the commission to do so. Governing bodies are required to comply with annual reporting requirements for the first time. The new statute allows the commission to set annual reporting requirements that each 911 governing body will have to basically comply with those annual reporting requirements to the commission annually. This includes providing GIS layers or descriptions of their emergency telephone charge collection area. The specifics as to what we're going to require or what the commission is going to require will be worked out in a rulemaking. So you will have input as to what is going to be part of that. We obviously don't want it to be onerous and be something that takes months for a 911 governing body to fill out. The main purpose of this requirement is so that the commission has the information necessary to do its annual reporting to the National 911 Implementation and Coordination Office, as well as the FCC and the annual report that we give to the General Assembly. So by requiring the governing bodies to give us the information we need, then we'll be able to complete those other statewide annual reporting requirements to the federal government as well as to the state legislature. With that, that's a major section. I think I'm going to stop at the end of each major section and ask for questions instead of waiting until the end, because I think the conversation will go more smoothly that way. So does anybody have any questions about the changes to the emergency telephone charges section of the statute?
Daryl, this is Eric. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Eric. This is Mandy, Daryl. I was just not specifically about your presentation on these changes, but will you make your slides available for those who maybe couldn't make today's meeting?
Yep, and I'm also recording this presentation, so they'll have both.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And this is Eric Bergman. I can't remember. It's been a few months, obviously, since we were working on the bill. What was the kind of the best estimate on what the statewide charge will be, and how much do you think it will generate?
I'll talk about that in a little bit. I can tell you what my estimate is of what it'll generate. I can't tell you what it will be because that'll be subject to the proceeding that we're opening tomorrow. Oh, sorry. The very thing you said not to ask about. Well, you can ask about it. I just can't answer.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Thanks,
and just to keep this clean, so I don't have to file something in the proceeding as an ex parte. Also, don't tell me your opinion as to what it should be.
No. Thanks, Daryl.
Anybody else? Okay, so moving on.
Daryl, you do have a couple questions in the chat box.
Oh, do I? Okay, let me look. Jerry says, where do the rates apply, or where do the rates need to be published annually? It doesn't really say, so it could be published in a resolution. It could be published on a web page if the 911 authority has a website. So it kind of leaves that up to how you want to publish it, but it does say that they need to be published annually. And I can get you the specific wording for that that's in the statute. And Katie says to disregard my question. Jerry beat me to it. So we'll move on from there. Emergency telephone charge changes. Oh, that was the last slide of the section I was already on. All right, so now we're on to the statewide 911 surcharge. So this is the new part. Starting January 1st, every phone bill in Colorado will have an additional charge on it for a statewide 911 surcharge. It has to be listed separately on the bill. That's what the statute says. The only exception is if they don't list fees separately on the bill. I think T-Mobile may be the only company that does that, where they just give you a bill that says it's X number of dollars, and then they pay all the fees on your behalf, so it's not listed separately on your bill. But otherwise, it has to be listed separately on the bill so that the customer knows how much of the 911 funds are going directly to the local 911 governing body and how much of it is going to the state 911 fund. The amount of this surcharge will be set by the commission on October 1st. It can be anywhere up to 50 cents. These surcharges will be remitted directly to the commission or its agent. We use another company, for instance, to collect telecom relay service charges. We may use that same company, at least to start with, to collect these surcharges. But either way, it is technically going to the commission. The funds will be distributed to the 911 governing bodies based on the number of concurrent sessions in their PSAP. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in a second. To answer your question, Eric, staff has estimated that we should be able to raise about $650,000 per penny of surcharge statewide. And it's a kind of a complicated process of how I came up with that figure. Essentially, I took survey data from all of the 911 authorities that fill out those online 911 authority profiles that we ask people to update every year. Took that, divided by their surcharge rate, and took into account their population that they were collecting from to see and how much they actually raised. And then we interpolated that through a spreadsheet statewide, and what we came up with was $648,000. Because that's based on partial responses to a voluntary survey, I can't say with 100% certainty how accurate that is, but it's the best figure that we have at this time as to how much we're actually going to raise. In future years, we'll be able to look back on past years of actual collections, so we'll be able to make a better estimate. And then the concurrent sessions, I talked about, the funds will be distributed to the 911 governing bodies based on number of concurrent sessions in their PSAPs. This is the same concurrent sessions that we're talking about when we're talking about the ESINet tariff from CenturyLink. It's the unit of pricing. So for instance, let's say, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, I know Larimer County has somewhere around 40 concurrent sessions, if I'm not mistaken. So how this will essentially work is that the amount of money raised from the carriers every month, the first thing that will happen is we're going to take our administrative costs out of it, which is limited at 4%. We don't automatically get 4%, but whatever the commission's administrative costs are up to 4%, we can take out of that total amount that is remitted by the carriers. The remaining money will be divided into 599 portions. That is how many concurrent sessions there are in the state. And then each 911 authority or governing body will receive an amount that is equal to however many portions they get, which is equal to how many concurrent sessions they have. So let's say if a 911 authority, if you add up all of the concurrent sessions at all of their PSAPs, they have 40 concurrent sessions, they will get 40 portions of the funding. And it is using the same unit for distribution as CenturyLink is using for the unit of pricing in the tariff. So there is some connection there that can be made between the two. As to what the commission will actually set the funds to is up to the commission. There is some guidance in the statute that the commission should take into account, but it's pretty vague. So it does give the commission quite a bit of discretion on that matter. So to give a more concrete example, let's say that a 911 governing body has 2 PSAPs, or public safety answering points, and they have a combined 8 concurrent sessions. CenturyLink's tariff is $752.22 per month per concurrent session. The commission could decide to set a surcharge rate to anything it deems is appropriate up to 50 cents, but let's say they set that rate at 9 cents. The estimated revenue from each penny of the statewide 911 surcharge is $650,000 annually. The monthly ESINet cost for 911 governing body A with its 8 concurrent sessions is $6,000 a month, $6,017, or excuse me, $17.76. the revenue from the statewide 911 surcharge, you figure out 70 or 9 cents times $650,000 comes out to $5.85 million a year. $5.85 million minus the 4% admin overhead comes to $5.6 million a year. $6 million a year, or $5.6 million a year divided by 600 sessions is $9,360 per concurrent session. You divide that, I'm not sure where I got the 1040, but let's say so it's 9,000. I've screwed up my own calculation here. So I'll fix that before I put the permanent slides up. But if it's $9,360 per concurrent session divided by 12 months, that's $780 per concurrent session per month times the 8 portions that 911 authority A. Well, hello. That's beautiful. As a reminder, don't put us on hold because we will hear your hold music. I don't know if they stopped or if somebody got them muted, whoever did that. Thank you. So let's say if it was 9 cents, we come up with $780 per month per concurrent session. In 911 governing body A's example, they get 8 portions of that because they have 8 concurrent sessions. So times 8, you end up with $6,240 a month, which is what I have here, despite my other miscalculations, which is slightly more than what they were paying, what they're going to be paying CenturyLink for their tariff. So I'm not saying this is the way it will go. This is one example of how it could be broken down if you were trying to match the costs of the tariff itself. This also means that in the future, if the tariff is raised to pay for additional costs, the statewide surcharge could also potentially be raised by a commensurate amount to reimburse the governing bodies for the additional expenses. If a governing body, 911 governing bodies, well, just let me give an example of what this means. So, for instance, if the tariff in the future were raised to provide funding for improvement to 911 network diversity in the state, the statewide 911 surcharge could also be raised to help reimburse the local 911 governing bodies for that additional cost. There may be additional features that we want to add to the ESINet in the future. For example, geospatial routing, any type of GIS work involved with that, text to 911 statewide through the ESINet, any type of additional service in the future, such as pictures, video. If we want to add those as an additional service, they'll also probably come with an additional cost that could be built into the tariff. By building it into the tariff and then using the same unit of pricing as we're using as the distribution portion for the statewide 911 fund, we can actually reimburse the 911 governing bodies for that cost. One important thing, because the 911 fund will be distributed based on number of concurrent sessions, we have to have something in place that provides some sort of accountability if a 911 governing body wants to increase its number of concurrent sessions. So the statute allows the commission to create rules for the 911 governing bodies to apply for a permission to increase their number of concurrent sessions that they're getting reimbursed for. This doesn't mean that a 911 governing body can't raise their concurrent sessions if they want to. It just means that if you want to get reimbursed for all of the concurrent sessions you have, there will be an application process for doing that to make sure that everybody is receiving an amount that is fair based on their actual call volume. We'll be setting up rules for how that will look, and you will all have opportunity through the rulemaking process to provide input on that, on what those rules will look like, but that is part of what's allowed in the statute. All right, now that was a lot, and that was probably our biggest, most impactful section because it's all brand new. So I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions for me. Jerry asks how often the funds will be distributed to the PSAPs. The answer is monthly. The statute basically requires us to clean that fund out every 60 days. So it will be when the carriers remit the surcharges to us. Let's put it in some concrete examples. So the new surcharge goes into effect in January. That's when the carriers should start collecting it from their customers. They will remit the funds to us in February, and we will have to do the distribution by March. So March of 2021, you should see the first distributions from this new statewide 911 surcharge, and you should see them monthly thereafter. Anyone else? Mandy says, confirming the funds will be distributed to the governing entity, not the PSAP. That is correct. They will be distributed but to the governing entity. Couple of reasons for that. One is because the governing entity has always served, or the governing, the 911 governing body has always served as the funding entity for 911 surcharge funds, and these funds can be used for the same things as the local emergency telephone charges. So it makes sense to remit them to the same place. The other reason is because it allows us to send checks to 58 locations potentially rather than 85. So it's a little bit easier administratively. Anyone else? Okay. So on to the prepaid 911 surcharge section. As a lot of you know, we currently have a prepaid 911 surcharge of 1.4%. It's applied at point of sale. I don't know if Kimberly Culp is on the call today, but she was really the champion of that bill back in 2011. Starting in January, the amount will change. It will no longer be a percentage. It will be a flat rate per transaction. That flat rate will be assessed based on a amount that will be set by the commission also on October 1st and will take effect on January 1st. The flat rate is actually set out fairly prescriptively in the statute. The flat rate has to be based on the average emergency telephone charge statewide as of July 1st, plus whatever the commission sets as the statewide 911 surcharge starting on January 1st. So as an example, if the emergency telephone charge average statewide as of July 1st this year was $1.28, let's say the commission sets the new statewide 911 surcharge at, picking a number at random, 25 cents. That means that, well, I should have picked one that had a zero on the end because it'll be easier for me to do the math in my head. Let's say they choose 20 cents. That means the new prepaid 911 surcharge will be $1.48, which is $1.28 plus that 20 cents. That will be charged per transaction, which essentially means that if you are buying prepaid minutes, if you're buying them more often than once a month, you're paying more than a billed customer, a monthly billed customer. But if you buy minutes less than once a month, then you're getting a little bit of a discount. But it does bring a more parity in terms of knowing if they bought minutes once a month, they're paying something closer to what all of the postpaid telephone customers are also paying. Here's an example I gave, just to kind of, there's another example different than the one I just gave. This amount will be remitted to Department of Revenue with sales tax returns, which is exactly what happens now. And then it will be distributed to the governing bodies based on wireless call volume. So none of that has changed. The only thing that has changed is the amount that's being paid is now a flat fee that will be set by the commission instead of a percentage. Anything on prepaid 911 surcharge before I move on? Okay, it'll be interesting to see, I think, whether this increases the amount of money that the 911 governing bodies are getting from the prepaid surcharge fund. It has always underperformed what we thought it would. It'll be interesting to see if this brings it more up to par with what we thought it was going to actually produce back when it was created in 2011. The next item is audits of carrier remittances. The commission will now have the authority to audit carriers' emergency telephone charge and statewide 911 surcharge remittance practices. In the past, this was always up to the local 911 governing bodies. The 911 governing bodies could audit carriers if they wish to do so. But most 911 governing bodies in the state of Colorado, frankly, do not have the resources to do that. And it also makes less sense to audit carriers for one county than it would make sense to audit them statewide. Now the commission will have the authority to do those audits either statewide, or we can do it on a local basis. The cost of these audits will come out of the commission's 4% administrative allowance from the statewide 911 surcharge revenues. So it's paid for through that statewide 911 surcharge, but we will never take, as I said earlier, we will never take more than 4% off the top of that for administrative costs. And part of that 4% can be used for doing audits. The commission can also use its administrative retention to reimburse a 911 governing body for doing its own audit of a carrier. We may have to come up with an application process for that, but theoretically, a 911 governing body or a group of 911 governing bodies could decide to do their own audit, and they could ask the commission to pay for that audit out of our 4% administrative allowance. What exactly that will look like, I'm not sure. That will be part of the overall rulemaking that we will do later on. But that is one of the things that is allowed for in the statute. The commission and or the 911 governing bodies that are conducting audits are also allowed to charge penalties and late fees to the carriers. That will also have to be spelled out in the permanent rulemaking that we'll be doing later this year, or starting later this year. These penalties, late fees, audit rules, and appeal procedures must all be in either ordinance or resolution at the governing body level. So if a governing body wishes to charge penalties or late fees as part of an audit process, it can do that, but it has to establish those in either ordinance or resolution. And at the commission level, it has to be in our rules. So we can't do these audits and actually file or impose penalties or fees until we have those spelled out in our rules. Any questions related to audits of carriers' remittances before I move on?
So Daryl, this is Jackie. So would it be best then to wait for the rulemaking to finish before boards actually create resolutions for the fees?
Well, there's nothing that says that your ordinances or resolutions regarding penalties and fees have to match what the commission does. But if you wanted to wait, you could see what the commission imposes and then use that as a model for your local ordinances or resolutions.
Okay, thank you.
Another source to look at would be City of Denver. I know City of Denver already has penalties and fees built into their city ordinances regarding 911 surcharge remittances, so you can take a look at them as well. Monica, can you explain your question to me? I'm not sure I understand it.
Yeah, so back when you were still talking about prepaid was when I put in the question. I thought the original language that we had drafted that we had audit capabilities. So we've always thought that the DOR had underreported prepaid. Mm-hmm. Is there any capabilities now for us to audit the DOR, or is that that was a non-starter because we didn't want government agencies auditing each other?
It's not so much an audit, but there is language in there that allows DOR to provide information to the commission regarding prepaid 911 surcharge remittances from the retailers. What exactly type of information we'll be requesting from them, I think, needs to be worked out. And it's not entirely clear whether we can share that information with local 911 governing bodies. But what we can do with it is we can look at it. We can look at it statewide, and we can look at it for specific areas, and hopefully see. Well, we know that there's a retailer that is selling prepaid telecommunications services in X area, but they're not on the list that we got from DOR as someone who's remitting those surcharges to DOR. So we can then work with DOR, maybe suggest that they do an audit of that retailer, or what other action, I'm not sure yet, but that's something we'll have to explore.
Okay, thank you.
Daryl, can I just jump in real quick since Tracy and I worked on this section?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so we worked on this section with DOR, and Tracy had calls with them to try and work a little bit on that language when we were drafting that bill. And Daryl framed it right. Before, we really couldn't do anything. There was just this DOR not going to share information regardless. So we had no ability to know if even a carrier, not a carrier, but a storefront was sending any money into Department of Revenue. So this really is going to help us at least be able, and I say we, it really is going to probably fall on Daryl's shoulders and his team's shoulders to create some sort of tracking to know, okay, Walmart in these different areas are sending in surcharge, etc. So I'm not going to say it gets us all the way there, but it's definitely more than what we currently have today.
Yes, I'm trying to pull up the actual language from the bill. Here it is. The department shall supply information regarding the administration of department, in this case is Department of Revenue, shall supply information regarding the administration of the prepaid wireless trust cash fund to the commission or a governing, oh, it does say governing body, or a governing body upon request. It doesn't say what information, so I'm sure that there'll be some negotiation there between the commission or the governing body and DOR as to what will be included in that. But to Kimberly's point, one of the biggest roadblocks we've had, or the roadblock we've had on getting information from DOR is that DOR considers all of its information confidential taxpayer information. So by having this language in here, it at least gives us something to work with when we're talking to DOR and say, we would like you to provide us with a list of who has remitted these funds. And they may supply the information with the understanding that it is confidential and that we can't share it outside of there, but the fact that it also says a governing body gives me hope that an individual governing body could go to DOR and request this information as well, and be able to get some data that they can then use to help track down any retailers that are being scofflaws and are not remitting the surcharge as they're supposed to be, or maybe just aren't aware of the fact that they're supposed to be. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt on intent, but that's the idea there. Monica, did that answer your question?
Absolutely, thanks.
You're welcome. Bill Duggan asks if there's anything in the bill that prevents legislators from sweeping 911 funds for other uses. And the answer is that the structure of the fund itself does that. Number one, it is not a fund in the state treasury. It is a fund that will be created by the commission that is not part of the general fund. There is language in the bill that specifies that the state 911 fund, which is the fund created by the remittances to the statewide 911 surcharge, is a trust fund, and that the money actually belongs to the 911 governing bodies that are going to be receiving it. So that would make it more difficult to be swept by the legislature. And then the other thing that helps protect it is that it has to be paid out monthly. So there will never be a huge pool of money just sitting in there waiting for somebody to find a purpose for it. Every month we will get money in from the carriers. Every month we will send the money out to the 911 governing bodies. So there should never be more than I want to say more than a few $100,000. It'll never be in the millions, and that money will go out every month. So there is that protection as well. Anything else? Any other questions about anything I've talked to up to this point, including audits of carrier remittances? Okay. Moving on, changes to eligible 911 expenses. There were a lot of changes to the wording of this section, but the same rule of thumb applies that applied before the changes, and that is if it's related to the provision of emergency telephone service or emergency notification service, it's still an allowable expense. Most of the language changes that were made were made to clarify that certain things are allowed rather than to exclude things. So it clarifies, for instance, that administrative costs of operating the governing body itself are allowable. In the past, that was always a gray area. I'll give an example. If you had a 911 authority that has an executive director, as some of the big ones in the state do, usually in the metro area, and you are paying that 911 authority director out of the 911 funds that you receive, it was always a question as to whether that was really an allowable expense or not. The legislation now has clarified that yes, that is an allowable expense along with any other administrative costs. So if you're paying a CPA to keep track of your funds for the 911 authority, if you are paying an attorney to help protect the 911 authority legally, that would be an administrative cost as well. So those types of costs are now allowable expenses. Clarifies that membership fees for state or national 911 organizations are allowable. That's always been a question in the past. Can we use 911 funds to pay for membership fees to NENA or APCO? That was a gray area. Now it's no longer a gray area. It is definitely an allowable expenditure. All related personnel expenses are allowable, whereas in the past it was restricted to 911 telecommunicators, essentially people who take and dispatch 911 calls, as well as people who maintained the 911 database, which was a phrase that was kind of vague and didn't really explain what we meant. Now, any personnel costs that are related to operating the emergency telephone service are an allowable expense. So it has become, for the most part, more expansive. These things, there are two things that can only be paid for out of 911 surcharges if all other PSAPs expenses are already paid. Those are equipment, radio equipment costs outside the PSAP. That does not include radio equipment costs inside the PSAP, which is sort of in the first bucket. So these are the things that are in the second bucket. Once everything in the first bucket is paid for, then you can pay for radio equipment outside the PSAP, meaning towers, other types of equipment, and personnel expenses for the PSAP and or the governing body. So that is, personnel expenses are allowable, but those have to be paid only if everything else has been paid for. So this might require some of you to look at what things you pay for out of your 911 surcharge funds and readjust what things you pay for. It doesn't mean you can't pay, you can't reimburse fewer things. You may just have to choose which things you are reimbursing. So this is somewhat impactful. So you may want to look at your budgets and see where your 911 funds are going, and see if you may need to reallocate those somewhat. So yeah, and that's basically the point that I made at the bottom of this slide. Any questions? Yeah, before I go on to the liability protections, any questions about that section? Bruce says, what if I want to increase my surcharge above the threshold and some of the money would be used to pay personnel expenses? That is allowed, Bruce, so long as that you're covering everything else in the first bucket first. And I think to some extent, some 911 authorities have started, they've stopped, we're not going to pay for equipment anymore, we're just going to pay personnel expenses because it's easier. And I totally understand that. The way this language fell out at the end, after all of the amendments, it makes it so that it's actually cleaner to pay for equipment and then pay for personnel expenses if you have money left over, rather than just pay personnel expenses and let the 911, the city or county pay for the equipment. So it's something you'll want to think about when you're looking at your budgets and how you use your 911 surcharge funds. So the next section is expanded liability protection. Previously, the basic emergency service provider, which is CenturyLink, and their employees were protected from liability as long as they, were making a good faith attempt to provide 911 service to all of the 911 centers in the state. They were protected. The new liability protection extends that. There's a whole new paragraph that extends that protection to other types of vendors that serve PSAPs. These include, but are not limited to, equipment providers, systems and software providers, hosted PSAP services, IT services, cyber security services. And this is essentially just a recognition that there are a lot of other vendors that provide service to PSAPs. And because it is mission critical service, that it carries a high level of liability if they make a mistake. And we don't want to discourage companies from doing business with PSAPs or 911 governing bodies. So this gives them a little protection so that they can provide those services without worrying about being sued into oblivion if they make a good faith error. And that was a short section. That's a one-page section. Any questions about the liability protections? Multi-line telephone system changes. Colorado's existing multi-line telephone system statute was completely outdated and out of sync with federal law and out of sync with Federal Communications Commission rules. Rather than try to keep up with those, because it's kind of a moving target right now. The commission just set new rules. They may adjust those rules again in the future. Rather than try to keep up with those changes, the new statute just says that MLTS operators in Colorado have to abide by the federal rules, and it requires the commission to create a complaint portal that people can use to notify the commission if companies are failing to meet the federal guidelines. And then we will be forwarding those complaints on to the FCC or the appropriate federal agency. It might be the federal, right now it'd probably be the FCC, but it could also be the Federal Trade Commission. So that is what is going to happen with those. We will probably be working on setting up that portal later this year, but frankly, it's lower down on my priority list right now with getting all of the permanent rules and the emergency rules in place so that we can continue with these processes. But this is taking longer than I thought because we're closing on the end of the hour here. We may go a little bit over, and I apologize for that. Any questions about MLTS before I talk about next steps, sort of the procedural side of this? Nope. Okay. So next steps, the first step is setting the new rates. The commission will be opening a proceeding tomorrow is the plan. It's going to be on the commissioner's weekly meeting agenda tomorrow. The commission will be opening a proceeding in which they will determine what the new threshold is at which approval is required for emergency telephone charge rates, what the new statewide 911 surcharge rate is going to be, and what the prepaid 911 surcharge rate is going to be. Those are the three things that the statute requires the commission to do by October 1st. There's also going to be an emergency rulemaking in association with that. The emergency rulemaking essentially just says the commission has the authority from statute to set these rates, and so these are the rates we're going to be setting, and these are the things that the commission will take into account as part of that rate setting. And it's really just the things straight out of the statute, so there's nothing surprising in there. But Commission Council felt that it was necessary that there be rules in place before the commission undertake this surcharge rate setting. The 911 governing bodies and other interested parties will have an opportunity to provide comment on this rate setting. They can do so by intervening in the proceeding, or they can do so just by simply filing comments with the commission and referencing this proceeding once the proceeding number is established, hopefully tomorrow. And then the commission must conclude this proceeding by October 1st. It'll probably be concluded a little bit before that, but the statutory requirement is that these things need to be set by October 1st. So we don't have a lot of time, and that is really the reason for the quick turnaround on the decision-making process regarding what those surcharge rates will be. Next year, my hope is that we can get started a lot sooner. We could not do it this year until after the governor signed the bill, so that kind of put a little bit of a time constraint on us. Then step 2, we're going to have additional emergency rulemaking this fall. That emergency rulemaking will cover things such as annual data collection requirements for the 911 governing bodies, the procedure for applying for increasing the number of concurrent sessions at a governing body, the procedure for carriers to remit statewide 911 surcharge funds to the commission, And I put in here that the emergency rules would cover audits of carriers, appeal of late fees and penalties. Those will probably actually get pushed off to the permanent rulemaking. Step 3, the carriers will begin remitting new statewide 911 surcharges on January 1st. Governing bodies will start receiving distributions. I said February. First of all, these say 2020. These should say 2021. Dang, I really should have proofread this better. I apologize for that. I said February 2021. It's actually probably going to be March of 2021 before you see your first payments. Permanent rulemaking to replace the emergency rules will take place in spring of 2021. So anytime we have an emergency rulemaking, that's a stopgap measure. It's something that we have to do right away. And then we do a permanent rulemaking to give people more input as to what those rules should be, so that we're not sidestepping the public input process. So actually what I'm anticipating now at this point is that as of tomorrow, I will be directed by the commission to initiate a stakeholder involved process to start writing these permanent rules, so that by spring of next year we can have those in place. And so my typos, which I will correct before I send these out to everybody aside, does anybody have any other questions for me? And I got it in right at 1 minute until 3. So I guess I got that part right, at least the timing of it. Does anybody have any questions for me? Was this helpful? Was this not helpful? I know I went through it all very quickly, but you know, if there's anything that you have additional questions or you don't really understand yet, I'm happy to try to explain that, or maybe we can even make that the subject of a future webinar. I'm getting some positive feedback through the chat, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. Well, my email address is on the screen. Also, my office phone number, which is currently forwarded to my home phone number, since I've been informed that I'll be working from home at least until January. So we have that to look forward to. If you guys think of anything else, if you're thinking about this later and you have any questions about how this will work, please email me and let me know. Do not email me with suggestions as to what you think the surcharges should be. We're going to be opening a process tomorrow that you can publicly provide those comments into. In order to keep this a clean process, don't let me know what you think what your thoughts are on what the surcharge rates should be or the threshold should be, because that'll be part of a public proceeding. And not seeing anything else, I will thank everybody for their time. You have a good rest of your afternoon, and we'll be talking again soon. Bye, everybody.